All right, I'd like to introduce David Alper. He's a member of the board of the John Howard Society since 2004. He's a social worker. He teaches at St. Boniface University. He teaches policy, health, and he helps people liaison to get through the practicum as social workers. He likes squash, bike, and softball. Please welcome David Alper.
Being a practicing atheist, I feel I'm with kindred folk here. I just want to reassure some of you. I saw some people nervously fidgeting when Jeff mentioned that I was a social worker. I'm not here to investigate your kids. I just want to reassure you about that. And I speak tonight as a concerned citizen. I'm not a lawyer, thank God. You know what Woody Allen said? I mean, it's bad enough I'm a social worker, but he had this nightmare where he had been transformed into this creature, the worst monster imaginable, that had the body of a lawyer and the head of a social worker. So I speak to you tonight, though, as a concerned citizen. Like Jeff said, I've been on the board of the John Howard Society since 2004. Actually, I applied for a job at the John Howard Society when I first moved to Winnipeg in 2004. I wasn't offered the job. The consolation prize was they asked me to join the board, and I've been on the board ever since. So I'd like to speak to you tonight, and I'll keep my comments brief because I'd like to engage in a question and answer period and dialogue and hear your feedback from you as well. But I would like to share with you some thoughts around Bill C-10, which recently passed through Parliament, because I think it's a very significant, not only transformation of our criminal justice system, but it really, I think, shows the way that our country is heading, and I think it's heading in the wrong direction. When Prime Minister Harper says that he's going to change the face of Canada, I think this is a very good example of how how the face of Canada is going to be changed, and not in a positive way, and I think we can look at many other examples of this as well. At the same time, I don't want to leave people feeling despairing that there's no hope. There's a lot of wonderful work that's being done locally here in Winnipeg and across Canada. And I'd like to share with you some thoughts about how what that work looks like, and how it could be further developed as well. And first of all, though, I'd like just to share with you some of the work that we do at John Howard Society of Manitoba. John Howard of Manitoba is part of a network of 57 John Howard Societies across Canada. Our mission really, in a nutshell, is to address the causes and consequences of crime. And most of the work that we do involves working with offenders either before, during, or after periods of incarceration. And we run a number of programs out of our offices, our building on Ellis Street, but as well we work within a number of the institutions, be it the Remand Center or Headingley, working with people who are incarcerated. So, for example, if I can just briefly tell you about the services, one of the main services we offer, and we have social work students as well from our faculty that do practicum, mainly with the reintegration services, which works with offenders who are leaving jails. Over 99% of people who are incarcerated in society will eventually be back out on the street. And what's going to happen to these people when they're back out on the street? Our reintegration services help people find housing, help them find jobs, help them find training, help them deal with issues like mental health, addiction, substance abuse issues they may be facing in their lives, try and get back on track, try and make sure that they're not to go back into a life of crime, accept responsibility for the actions that they've done. We offer a literacy program mainly through the Winnipeg Remand Center. We actually develop our own literacy workbooks, which are distributed across Canada. We have some award-winning programs. One of our participants at the Remand Center actually won a National Literacy Award. He writes children's books. Many people who are incarcerated not completed high school, and I don't have to tell you what it's like trying to find a job in today's economy without a high school education. We run a restorative resolutions program, which is a very interesting program, which is designed as finding alternatives to incarceration, whereby offenders accept responsibility for the harm that they have done to individuals and the community, where instead of going to jail, they will provide restitution either in a monetary manner or doing community service. 96% of the time when we go to court and present this as an option to the judge accepts that plan. It has a wonderful success rate in terms of much lower recidivism rates as compared to people who are convicted and go to jail. And this is also a way of saving money for the taxpayer as well. The newest program that we've just started is a program which we call the Bail Assessment and Supervision Program, which works with offenders who have been arrested, who normally wouldn't be eligible to receive bail. They are considered at medium or high risk to reoffend. And what we do is we work with these offenders. John Howard Society works with male offenders. There's the Elizabeth Fry Society works with female offenders. What we do is we work and try and identify what the issues these people are facing, be it mental health problems, addiction, substance abuse, lack of literacy, education, job training, so on and so forth. We develop an individualized plan, and these people, instead of spending time in jail, basically twiddling their thumbs at the remand center where there's really no programming, they will be in a facility in our building where they will go through intensive programming. Once again, this is another win-win type of situation where it's a lot cheaper for the taxpayer to avoid incarceration, and these programs have a proven track record of greatly reducing recidivism rates as well. This is also a type of program that encourages personal responsibility and accountability as another way of reducing crime and increasing safety for members of the community. If you read the newspapers, generally what you hear about, especially in the Winnipeg Sun, but often in the Winnipeg Free Press, is that we're thug huggers, we're bleeding heart liberals, we're soft on crime, that if you do the crime, you gotta do the time, right? Well, let's look more closely into that. Now, when we talk about Bill C-10, which recently passed through Parliament, it's also known as the Safe Streets and Communities Act. What is it? We're talking about a piece of legislation. Like I said, I'm not a legal expert. This is a very complicated piece of legislation. It brought together 9 different laws that had previously been before Parliament. They were packaged into one and adopted quite quickly. Very politically popular piece of legislation. The Conservatives ran, it was a main part of their platform. And what does it do? Well, among other things, it doubles the waiting time for people who have criminal records. We know that people with criminal records, often it's a very big barrier to getting a job, reintegrating the job market, which is a main obstacle for people getting out of jail. There are 3 million adult Canadians with a criminal record. So that's basically 1 in 5 adult males have a criminal record. I have a criminal record. And a lot of, I'm sure some people in this hall as well have criminal records. So if you go out in the street, you got to figure 1 out of every 5 males you see who's an adult has a criminal record. So the government has made it much more difficult to get a pardon, not only by increasing the fee to apply for a pardon. They don't call it a pardon anymore. You have to pay $630. That's gone up from $150. But also, they're making it very difficult, if not impossible, for many adults to actually receive a pardon. So, if you've done the crime and you've done the time, the government's now saying it's not enough. We're going to make you keep on paying, possibly forever. And we don't see how this makes our communities any safer by making it more difficult for people to get jobs. C-10 also imposes harsher sentences on young offenders. Come back on to that later. It also imposes mandatory minimum sentences, mainly for drug-related offenses. We'll talk about that in greater detail. And it places restrictions on the use of conditional sentences. So people that would be on probation serving their sentences in the community and not in jail. Well, what is wrong with C-10? It obviously adopts a punitive retributive approach, not based on rehabilitation, but on the idea that the way we're going to make society safer is by placing individuals in jail for longer periods of time. And one of the things that we've repeatedly asked both the federal and the provincial government is, could you please provide us with proof, scientific proof? Where are the studies that show that incarcerating more individuals for longer periods of time is an effective way of making our communities, our streets safer? And we have never been able to get any response from either provincially or the federal government to that question, simply because there is no proof. There is no studies, there are no studies out there that show that incarceration is an effective way of reducing crime rates. And the approach that the federal government is adopting with C-10 is very similar to what was implemented south of the border about 30 years ago, where a very tough on crime approach was implemented. In the United States over the last 30 years, incarceration rates have increased 600%. Costs as well have gone up about 6 times. The overall crime rate in the United States over that same period has decreased anywhere between 15 and 20%. Over the last 30 years in Canada, we didn't follow that tough on crime, throw them in jail, throw away the key, lock them up type of mentality. Those type of laws have not been in place. Crime also decreased by a similar amount in Canada. So there is no proof that this type of laws are actually effective in terms of making our communities any safer. It very much appears to be a policy that is based on ideology and not on fact. And it's quite ironic that our NDP government here in Manitoba is being very supportive of most of the provisions of C-10, when many other provincial governments across Canada have been very much outspoken against this type of legislation. For example, the Conservative Party member of the Newfoundland government and their Minister of Justice, their Attorney General by the name of Felix Collins, was quoted in the Globe and Mail last November as saying he's never seen a study that favors more prison time as a way to cut rates of reoffense and improve public safety. Quebec government, Ontario government, PEI have all spoken out against C-10. If you look at what happened in the States over the last few decades, social service programs that are actually effective ways of reducing crime rates have been cut to the point where there are 4 states in the US where they actually spend more on locking people up. Their corrections budgets are now more, they spend more money on corrections, on jails, than they do on education. And this is the way that we'll be heading under C-10. Victor Hugo once said that to close the door of a prison, you need to open the door of a school. Our own federal minister of justice, in response to the complaints of the provinces that they weren't going to be able to pay for increased costs related to the increased number of people that have to incarcerate as a result of C-10, responded by saying that the provinces should take the federal transfer payments that they receive from Ottawa to build new jails. And we know that the federal transfer payments are designed through the Canada Health and Safety Transfer Act to pay for health and post-secondary education. So it's telling us a bit to twist the words of Victor Hugo around and do the exact opposite, close schools basically to pay for jails. What about mandatory minimum sentences? What's wrong with that? That sounds like a really good idea. Get these drug pushers off of our streets that are preying on our children, right? Well, the standard argument in favor of mandatory minimum sentences is that they deliver certainty, right? If you do X, the minimum punishment will be Y. It's simple, it's clear, it's predictable. and it supposedly makes mandatory minimum sentences a strong deterrent against crime. I said so. Mandatory minimums produce clarity, simplicity, and predictability. Do the crime, you do the time, right? Well, I don't think so. This bill includes a mandatory minimum sentences of 6 months for growing more than 5 and fewer than 201 plants of marijuana with the intent of trafficking. There's also a mandatory minimum sentence of 9 months for anyone who grows between 1 and 201 marijuana plants for the purposes of trafficking when certain factors are present, including that, I quote, the person used real property that belongs to a third party in committing the offense. So Justice Minister Rob Nicholson says that these measures don't target recreational drug users, only the big traffickers, right? And we all know who the traffickers are, right? They're the biker gangs, the Hells Angels, the gangbangers, those dangerous people. But the minister never mentions the legal definition of trafficking. It includes selling marijuana for profit, as anyone would expect, but profit actually isn't essential to the definition. Simply giving someone a joint is considered trafficking. So is offering to give them marijuana. So anyone who passes a joint to a friend is considered a trafficker under the law, even if the friend declines the offer. That means that there's a lot of traffickers in Canada. Some are members of Parliament, and I would guess there are probably some in this room as well. And remember that phrase, real property that belongs to a third party. That's what a rented apartment is. So imagine a university student living in a rented apartment who rolls a joint and offers it to her boyfriend. She grows a single marijuana plant, and she's just like a trafficker, subject to a mandatory minimum sentence of 9 months in jail. Are these outcomes simple, clear, and predictable? Hardly. They're pretty shocking as hell. But mandatory minimums sentences have a nasty tendency to do that. I don't know if you remember the infamous case in the United States, in California, of a gentleman who was sentenced to life in prison for stealing a pizza, right? That was because of mandatory minimums. The law didn't say that pizza thieves shall get a life sentence. The law said anyone convicted of a third felony would get a life sentence. So pizza theft is normally a misdemeanor, not a very serious offense, but that poor fellow had committed previous felonies. And a different law said that petty theft committed by anyone convicted of felonies must be prosecuted as a felony. So because his misdemeanor pizza theft became his third felony, he was sent to prison for life. An outcome that pretty much everyone considered totally insane. Of course, our federal justice minister will protest and say that no reasonable prosecutor would convict that hapless university student to 9 months in jail for one joint. He would charge her with a lesser offense, or he would drop the charges altogether. But the bill is clear. It was passed by Parliament. It is the will of Parliament. Prosecutors may say it is not their place to frustrate the clearly expressed will of Parliament, which is a pretty reasonable thing to say. And notice how strange it is for governments to rely on the discretion of prosecutors to keep their mandatory minimum sentences from producing injustices. After all, the whole point of mandatory minimum sentences is to do away with discretion. So, no ambiguity or uncertainty. It's all perfectly clear and predictable. But mandatory minimums actually don't do away with discretion. Basically what they do is they take it out of the judge's hands and they hand it over to prosecutors. So the system is still ambiguous, uncertain, and unpredictable. It's just ambiguous, uncertain, and unpredictable in a different way. Now, I'd like to get back to the issue of pardons as well. Many people have categorized the changes to pardons, the reason that it's so much more difficult to obtain a pardon now, as the Graham-James provision. The government has latched on to one very highly publicized individual who was granted a pardon, and they're making it much more difficult for millions of Canadians to reintegrate society. Now, we're not saying that society doesn't have to be protected from individuals like Graham-James, but the question we ask is, should federal legislation that affects millions of Canadians in a very negative manner be based on the case of one individual? And how will making it much more difficult for individuals with criminal records to obtain jobs, how will that make our streets any safer and our communities any safer? What about the idea of imposing harsher sentences for young offenders? This is a provision that is being opposed most vociferously by the province of Quebec. Quebec, interestingly enough, has the lowest youth crime rate in all of Canada, and it has adopted an approach very much based on rehabilitation and not on incarceration. And they have been very vocal in stating that they want to maintain this system as a way of keeping communities safer. This flies in the face of what the federal government is doing with C-10 by cutting back on many, many programs that are focusing on rehabilitation of youth offenders. I think we have a good example here in Manitoba of a program that has made our streets safer and has reduced crime, which does not solely focus on punitive vengeance, retributive measures, which is the auto theft program. Manitoba used to have one of the highest rates of auto theft. It's gone down by something like 80% in the last 5 years through a pretty intelligent program, which not only which heavily relies on community supports for young people who are involved in auto theft. And so we have examples even locally of programs where it's not simply based on locking young people up, and they're very proven. The track record shows that these programs are very effective in making our communities safer. Like I mentioned before, unfortunately, our provincial government has been very outspoken in support of most of the measures of C-10. The John Howard Society of Manitoba, along with many other broad sectors of the population, from the legal community, from the Aboriginal community organizations, has been very outspoken about what we see as the negative impact that C-10 will have on our criminal justice system and on our country as well, whereby resources are being taken away from preventive programs and are going to be placed more and more. The focus will be on incarcerating individuals without looking at what is causing people to commit crime in the first place. And I think if we're looking for solutions, we have to look at who is being incarcerated and why. If we look at Manitoba and Canada, in Canada as a whole, 3% approximately of the population is Aboriginal, 17% of people in jails are Aboriginal. Here in Manitoba, less than 15% of our population is Aboriginal. Approximately 70% of people in jail in Manitoba are First Nations people. 70%, yes. And I think to understand that situation, we have to go beyond the very simplistic images and messages that we hear day in, day out in the media, right? That there's the good guys and the bad guys. It's a black and white. Just lock them up and throw away the key, and that's going to solve the problem. Unfortunately, there's no magic wand. There's no simple solution to this problem. It's going to take a lot of hard work. It's going to take a lot of time. If we look at the fact that so many people who are locked up in our institutions here in Manitoba are Aboriginal, it's an obvious legacy of colonialism going back hundreds of years in this country, most recently manifested through residential schools, more recently through the misguided child welfare policies known as the 60s scoop that only recently my own profession of social work is just beginning to address the harm and the ongoing damage that's been done to Aboriginal communities. Just recently at our university, our social work faculty sponsored a conference on the community of South Indian Lake, which is in northern Manitoba, about 130 kilometers as the crow flies northwest of Thompson. And we sponsored a talk by the community health representative. This is a gentleman I just met on the plane last year, and he told me he worked in health, and I teach a course in healthcare, so I was quite interested in the work that he did. And I said, well, what's the largest health problem that's facing your community? He says, we don't have running water. So we have a situation where we have thousands of people in northern communities living in third world conditions. Many of those young people flee those communities, come to Winnipeg and other urban centers looking for work, looking for a better quality of life, don't have education, and often end up in gangs. They can't make it here. And they're facing tremendous obstacles in finding jobs and getting the education necessary to get good jobs. And so we see that the problem is systemic, it's been ongoing, it's not going to be solved overnight, and it's not going to be solved with the type of solutions that are being proposed through C-10. If you look at who is incarcerated, you'll see that many, many people haven't completed high school. Many of them grew up in foster care, had parents who were incarcerated. The statistics say that 67% of non-Aboriginal and 82% of Aboriginal offenders have substance abuse or addictions issues. Somewhere around 30% of offenders have significant mental health issues. Many offenders suffer from fetal alcohol syndrome. There are many, many issues facing people who are incarcerated and who end up back on the streets. And these are the type of issues that need to be addressed if we really want to if we're serious about making our streets safer and our communities any safer. So I'd like to share with you some of the work that we've done with other community groups here in Winnipeg in terms of proposing alternative solutions. Like I mentioned before, we've been very vocal here in Manitoba, and we've been very much at the forefront of speaking out against C-10 and also of proposing alternative solutions that are based more on prevention. I'd just like to take a couple of minutes to talk about some of the work that we've done here, because we've certainly raised our profile in the media, and I think it's an interesting lesson sometimes in how the media and how politics works. We have been very vocal in proposing alternative solutions to C-10, looking at prevention. We've organized rallies in front of the legislature last fall, press releases. We published a report with other community groups, which is called Bill C-10, The Truth About Consequences. And last fall, we also had a meeting with Justice Minister Andrew Swan. And after that, a couple of weeks later, we went to the Legislative Assembly to present a petition to the Premier's office, an online petition which had been signed by over 100,000 Canadians against C-10. We got dressed up as cowboys. I was accompanied by John Hutton, who is the Executive Director of the John Howard Society of Manitoba, because we wanted to make the point that Texas, which is a state which for many decades focused on incarceration, has recently turned their policies 180 degrees. They are actually in the process of closing jails there. They're reinvesting that money in drug rehab, mental health programs, community-based preventive programs, and their economy actually is going down. And there have been many politicians, many spokespeople from Texas and other parts in the States, even very right-wing politicians like Newt Gingrich, who are telling the Conservative Party of Canada that they're on the wrong track, that these policies don't work, and that, we should be thinking of what works. And so we went to the legislature, and make a long story short, we tried to enter the legislature Security came out and basically shoved John Hutton away, and we thought this was not a very respectful way of treating citizens who were just coming to the legislature to deliver a petition. And in our conversations with the Premier's office, we said, you know, I don't know if you want us to send out a press release telling the media and the citizens of Manitoba, this is the way you're treating citizens who come to air their grievances. And the Premier's office said, no, don't send out that press release. We'll get you a meeting with the Premier within a week. And lo and behold, within a week, we had a meeting with the Premier. Tells you something about the power of the media in our society. It tells you also how reactive politicians are, and how sometimes they only respond because if they think they're going to get bad press. I don't know what that says about our political process. But certainly it was a chance for us to air our grievances and put across our position around what should be funded. And just before I finish, I'd just like to take another few minutes to talk about some of the positive. How am I doing for time?
We're anytime now.
Okay. So quickly, I'd just like to finish up by just talking about some of the solutions, the community-based solutions, where we think instead of the $90 million that we've calculated that C-10 will cost the province of Manitoba, we looked at 4 different areas where we think that money would be much better spent. So we talked about employment initiatives, community-based initiatives like a labor market intermediary, which would fill the gap in services, whereby people who get a job often need more support while they're making that transition to employment. Skilled trades program, we have a shortage of skilled construction workers. There are many unemployed Aboriginal young men in Winnipeg who could fill those positions, very well-paid positions. John Howard Society provides office space now to an Aboriginal organization known as OPK. OPK had their federal funding cut. They work with gang members from the North End, provide them training and support to work in the construction trades, mainly renovating older homes, make them more energy efficient. It's what I call a win-win-win situation. You're reducing incarceration, you're providing good paying jobs and training for these former gang members, keeping them out of jail, saving the taxpayer money, and you're also having a beneficial effect on the environment, reducing emissions of greenhouse gases by making homes in the North End inhabited by low-income families more energy efficient. We talked about mental health and addictions, providing more treatment options for people in the community, things like providing more emphasis on harm reduction policies. The Supreme Court of Canada recently issued a judgment stating that the supervised injection site in Vancouver should be kept open. We think the province should follow suit, like Quebec has already announced, and open a number of sites in Winnipeg where drug users could exchange needles, reduces HIV transmission rates. It's another win-win situation. FASD programs need to be supported. Programs also that not only provide training but also provide healing and cultural reclamation for Aboriginal people, such as Urban Circle Training Program. We also talked about increasing education and family supports, increasing funding for early childhood education, daycare, training more Aboriginal newcomers to work in daycares. And lastly, we talked about the importance of funding more housing. When we're talking about housing, it's a fundamental human right. People are extremely vulnerable if they don't have access to safe, affordable housing. If you're looking at the most vulnerable people in our society, about half of them, we're talking about generally people who are on income assistance, about half of them have to rent on the private rental market. I don't know if people are aware how much a single individual who is considered able to work receives from what they call general assistance or welfare in Manitoba. It's $576 a month. $285 a month is the rental allowance. One of the projects I ask my students to do in one of the social policy classes I teach is you have to pretend you're living on social assistance for a month. You have to go out and find an apartment and then make a budget. I don't know about you, but I don't know how you can survive on $576 a month in Winnipeg. considering what the rates are. The shelter allowance, $285, has gone up barely since 1992. And so one of the things where we think the government would have a tremendous impact would be by raising the shelter allowance so that people could at least pay, well, they would be able to afford at least 75% of median market rents. We talk about increasing supports for social housing as well. And so I'd just like to finish off by just telling you a little bit of a story of an individual. And this is an individual. It's an interesting story, and it tells, I think, shows the way that we need to go. This is a story of a young Aboriginal gentleman in Winnipeg by the name of Carson Bruce. He just completed one crack deal and was on his way to another when he decided to drop his resume off at a community organization called BUILD. BUILD works with former gang members, gets them involved, trains them in the construction trades. He'd heard about the nonprofit, this company, from a friend, and they thought they might give him a chance, despite the fact that he had a long criminal record, he didn't have a driver's license, he hadn't completed his high school education. And this gentleman went through the program and ended up finding a job. And last November 4th, when we had the rally in front of the Legislative Assembly, one of the speakers at the rally was the executive director of BUILD Winnipeg, Sean Loney. And when Sean was speaking, he heard his name being called out from someone who was up on a roof. And that turned out to be Carson Bruce. He was standing on the roof where he was part of a work crew doing renovations. He found a job, good paying job now, left his life of crime. He's also reversed direction, this gentleman, and it took a job, but not jail, to get him on track. And we think it's time for our federal, provincial governments as well to reverse direction to get on the proper track. Thank you very much.
So we have two things to do. One is to ask questions, for those of you that have questions, and the second one is, just like last time I recorded the presentation, to reintroduce him, because I forgot to turn on the camera to do that part. So, don't go away, and I just want you to know it's 5 after 7 and the buffet closes at 8. So, feel free to ask questions, but know that eventually we have to get out there to get our food before it closes. So, by all means, have fun.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
There's a lot of facts and figures and good information in this. Do you have the website that has it just going all on and I kind of write something.com here?
Yeah. I would suggest you go to the website of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Manitoba, CCPA. So they have this publication on their website, which is Bill C-10, The Truth About Consequences. So if you go to their website and you could actually just go, there's a section for publications and look under Manitoba, and it'll be pretty easy to find. There's another publication as well, a really interesting study I'd also like to mention. I have the exact title of it here. I wrote it down, just find it, which is co-authored by the director of that organization I mentioned, OPK, which works with gang members. It's called If You Want to Change Violence in the Hood, You Have to Change the Hood, Violence and Street Gangs in Winnipeg's Inner City. And it's a fascinating study because what they did is they interviewed a half-dozen gang members. They actually went to a hotel in rural Manitoba. They didn't feel safe doing the interviews in Winnipeg. And they asked the gang members, like, what would you say to younger people? And they unanimously said, we tell them, don't get in a gang. Like, we don't think you should follow in our footsteps. And they talk about what they think would actually make a difference. They also talk about what it was like for them growing up and the violence and the extreme poverty that they faced. It's a fascinating study, so it's another study I would definitely recommend to people. But yes, CCPA, we actually are also organizing a forum. I can put a plug in here now if people are interested in more information about this subject. We're organizing a forum on May 10th, which is a Thursday. It's a day-long forum. It's called Justice in a Post-C-10 World. The keynote speakers are Paula Malaya, who is a lawyer originally from Manitoba. She just published a book called Fearmonger about the Harper crime agenda, as well as Justice Barry Stewart, who is a recently retired judge from the Yukon. He was interviewed on The Current recently. Very articulate gentleman, spoke out very strongly against C-10. And it's free admission. You need to register beforehand, but the information for that is also on the website of the CCPA if people are interested. There was another question here.
So where is that going to be?
That's going to be at the Masonic Temple, 420 Gordon, Confusion Corner. It's going to be all day from 9 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. on Thursday, May 10th. But you do need to register beforehand. But I have the information here. I can circulate. But if you go to the CCPA website, you'll find all the information as well.
Thank you very much for your great presentation.